Appalachian Harvest is a food hub located in Southwest Virginia that provides regional herb and vegetable farmers with training, technical support, aggregation, and distribution services, connecting them to retail markets. We currently source produce from farmers in Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This webinar is made possible by Risk Management Agency 2018 Risk Management Education Partnership Program.
Hello and welcome to Soils and Fertility. My name is Scott Gerald, the Extension Agent in Scott County, Virginia. And today what we're going to be looking at is both the soil component and how that affects the plant's ability to grow and to be able to produce a crop based on its nutritional attributes. And when we look at the beginning of soil fertility, when we look at plant nutrition, we have to look at the soil itself. So the first question that I normally ask folks is, what is soil? And there's many different answers we get, but basically soil can be broken down into both organic and inorganic particles. The inorganic particles being the mineral fraction of the soil, or what rocks it was developed from, and the organic particles being the decomposed and the decomposing organisms that are found within the soil or on top of the soil. We're also going to have pores in between each of the inorganic and organic particles, which will provide a pathway for both water and air to travel through that soil profile. When we look at what the functions of soils are, we find that it's a support or some type of medium that allows that plant to be able to take root and to provide structure for that plant so it does not fall over. And it also provides the essential nutrients that those plants need to grow. Soils are also the principal factor that controls the fate of water as it goes through the hydrological system, looking at both things such as water loss, the utilization of water, contamination, and even purification as the water goes through that soil profile. Soils are also the nature's recycling system as we look at the products that are assimilated into their base elements and made available for the plants to reuse. It provides habitats for living organisms, everything from small mammals and reptiles, all the way down to tiny insects and microscopic cells. The important thing we also see with soils is it is an engineering medium, and it allows us as humans to be able to build an ecosystem on top of that soil. It provides us a foundation for most of our roads, the houses, the buildings that we occupy, and it also provides building material in the form of both earth fill and other natural products such as bricks. When we look at soil formations, there are 5 major factors in the soil formation: parent material, the climate, the organisms or biological factor, topography, and time. We'll look at how each one of these impacts a soil's formation. So the parent material influences the soil formation by different rates of weathering. The nutrient content that it has available for the plants to be able to use as they break down and are released, and then the particle sizes that they contain. The less developed a soil is, the greater the impact the parent material will have. And by saying less developed, it means a younger soil. Climate is one of the dominant factors in soil formation as we look at, in particular, time, as the climate shows us the effects of both precipitation and the temperature on the breaking down of that parent material. We can find those influences in the development of detectable layers, where we might find clays, other organic type of colloids, carbonates, and soluble salts that move downward through the horizon. The organisms, or the biotic life, is the activity of the living plants and the animal, and the decomposition of their organic wastes and residues as it influences the soil's development. So as a plant grows, the roots then follow through cracks, and as those plants' roots start to expand, They're going to crack those rocks. It's also going to release, to some extent, some acids that's going to break down that parent material. We can find burrowing animals that may open holes in the soil. And we also are going to find that that decomposing organic matter is going to increase both organic matter content and also release nutrients back into that soil for plants to use. Topography is mainly an influence on soil formation through the associated water and temperature relations. So if we look at topography, depending on how flat or how steep it is, we also find that it is influenced dramatically by the amount of moisture and temperature that goes along with that topography. So when we look at it, depending on how cold, how hot, how arid, or how wet, the slope aspect of it, the decomposition rate of the organic material, all of this is going to affect how quickly a parent material breaks down. The one thing that we do not have much control over is time, and that is the length of time that it takes to develop distinct horizons, and that can be greatly impacted by the climate, by the parent material, the organisms that are present, and the topography of that land. All of these factors over time determine the rate of soil formation and how the topography or the landscape itself is changed. When we look at the development of a soil horizon, we can find the R, which is at the very bottom, the bedrock or the parent material. Directly above that is the partially weathered parent material. It still has the characteristics and the look of the bedrock in which it developed, but it's starting to break down, and you can actually break apart the components of that parent material in that partially weathered horizon. B is the area of accumulation. This is where the soil itself is starting to form. We find the E layer, which is the zone of alluviation. This is where we find soluble salts and other materials that have been accumulated as they leach through the A layer and the organic layer. The A layer being the mineral fraction, which is combined with organic matter, and the O layer being the organic matter itself. The way I normally describe this zone of alluviation or the leach layer is it's sort of like you hit a little bit of a clay layer where that water stops, and it allows time for nutrients and other things to be able to settle out as that water slowly percolates through the clay that we find in that B layer. We also look at the physical properties of the soil, and the physical properties include the texture, the structure, and the color. The texture is the grouping of the soil particles based on the size groups or the soil separates. And we find those broken down by size into sand, silt, and clay. The relative proportions of each one of these soil separates are what determines the soil texture. And then we use the textural triangle to determine the textural name after we have calculated the percentages of sand, silt, and clay. Looking at the textures, we can go from sands anywhere from 0.25 on up to 2 millimeters in diameter. We can find silt, which is 0.002 to 0.05 millimeters in diameter, and clay, which is smaller than 0.002 millimeters. When we look at determining the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in our soils, we can take a sample. We want to try to remove any of the rocks, the pebbles, the roots, other organic matter. We're going to screen that through a 2 millimeter sieve. In the laboratory, we're going to burn off any of the organic matter with hydrogen peroxide. And then we suspend the soil in a Calgon solution. And what that does is adds a surfactant, so it breaks apart the different fractions of the soil size. As we shake that soil up in that Calgon solution and then allow it to settle, Stokes' law of settling velocities tells us that the larger that particle is, the faster it's going to settle out. And it gives us an opportunity then to be able to determine particle size according to time as those soils separate out. We can determine sand after 15 to 20 minutes of settling. We determine silt after 2 hours, and then we subtract the volume, the total volume from the volume of sand and silt to find the clay percentage after that. Then we can take those percentages to the textural triangle, and we can determine what that soil's textural name is based on the amount of sand, silt, and clay that is present in the soil. We can also do this in a less formal format by doing what's called a field method. And that's where we would place a small amount of soil in our hand. We would slightly wet it. Then we would try to form a ball out of that soil by squeezing it in our hand. If we can have no ball present, if it just breaks apart in our hands, then we know that we have a sandy soil. If it will form a firm ball, then we squeeze that soil through our thumb and our forefinger to see if we can squeeze a ribbon out of that soil. If we can create a ribbon over 2 inches in length, we know that we have a heavy clay soil. If we squeeze a ribbon but cannot make the 2 inches, then we know we have a silt. This is a good field method for us to determine texture and give us a rough idea of what type of soil we're going to be working with. When we also look at the physical properties, we can look at the structure, and that's the arrangement of sand, silts, and clay into a stable or cemented aggregate. This is what occurs when the soil itself crumbles and breaks apart and shows its natural shape. We can refer to soils as either being a structured or a structureless type of soil. If we look at structureless, these are ones that will not come apart into any determined shape or pattern. So a single-grained structureless soil would be something like a sand. A massive structureless soil would be like clay. And we all know the modeling clay that we played with as children. When you worked with it, it would not tear apart or break apart. It just more or less would squeeze together as we used it. When we look at the structured type of soils, we can look at products such as a granular. This is where it breaks into small grains as it breaks apart naturally. We can also look at platy structures, which forms plates or layers. Blocky, which is similar to granular but larger in size. Columnar, which are small cylinders that form in the soil with round sides. And prismatic, which are going to form those cylinders, but it's going to be a prism. Those sides are going to be flat on that soil structure. The last thing when we look at the physical properties of soils is going to be the color. And when we look at the color, it can indicate a lot of soil features that we may not see with the eye. A change in that soil color can give us an idea of what the mineral composition of that soil is, depending on whether there's blacks, oranges, reds, even greens and grays. If we look at mottled type of soils, which means there's different colors in there, it can indicate a change in the redox, which is the oxidation or the reduction of iron. And if we think about iron, if we allow it to oxidize, we know that as being rust, which has a reddish tint to it. So an oxidized soil would be a reddish colored soil if it's high in iron content. If it's high in iron content, but we see more of a silverish or a black color, that can mean that the oxygen has been excluded from that, and instead of having that red color, it has a natural sort of a grayish color of the iron itself. We refer to that as glaying, which means that the soil can be waterlogged, which excludes the amount of oxygen reaching the iron and keeps it in its natural color or state. It also means it's probably not going to be a good place for us to plant because there's an increased chance that water stands there for a prolonged period of time. When we look at soil itself, though, everything that comes together brings us into the ecological impacts that soil can have. When we look at soil, I prefer to look at it as a living, breathing ecosystem which allows for all life to be supported. There's very few things that we do on a day-to-day basis that does not come from soil. From the roads that we drive in, from the houses that we live in, to the food that we eat, everything is derived from the soil. Even the oxygen that we breathe comes from the plants that are supported by the soil, that are rooted in the soil through its structure and are provided with the nutrients that they need to be able to grow. The structure that we spoke about, the texture, the chemical properties, and all of these other things of the soil determines how efficient that ecosystem is going to be. We have to remember that not only does soil act as this plant growth medium, but it's also a filtration system, it's a recycling system, and it also helps in the carbon cycling system also. When we look at the nutritional status of a soil, I sort of equate soil fertility as like a savings account. You can only withdraw so much without making a deposit before you go broke. So the nutrient reserves that are naturally inherent within a soil has to have deposits made to replace what the plants withdraw for them to be able to grow. And depending on your soil's ability to hold these nutrients depends on how big your initial deposit within that soil is. Fertilizer I equate to our monthly paycheck. It's a regular supply that we know is there and is ready for us to use. Depending on whether we add more than a plant will use determines whether we build up the soil's reserves or we add to that savings account. When we look at the soil test results, this is where we derive low, medium, high, and very high results, depending on the amount of reserves that we have available for those plants to be able to use. For example, if I have a high reserve and I know the plant needs a small amount, I can use a small amount of nutrients and still add to the reserve. I can look at a low reserve nutrient status. I can add a little bit of fertilizer to it, but if the plant needs more than what I am applying, I'm taking away from the nutrient reserve in the end. The same way if I'm using a high reserve, if I only use a small amount of fertilizer and use a greater amount of plant needs, I'm still winding up using more of the fertility than what is initially in that plant reserve. So I'm losing money in that bank account. However, if we start out with low reserves and we add a lot of fertilizer, a lot of resources above and beyond what that plant needs, we can still increase the amount of nutrients that's available to that plant for use. So the soil's nutritional status depends largely on how we manage the amount of inputs that we place into that soil. The only way that we can know where that nutritional status of a soil is with a soil sample. And once we determine what that baseline is, then we can develop a nutrient management plan that gives us an idea of how much nutrients those plants are removing and whether or not we're putting enough nutrients back in the soil to either keep it at an even level or either add to or take away from the reserve that's in that soil. There's a lot of different factors that go into determining the availability of nutrients to the plant, how much water is in that soil that carries the nutrients to those plant roots, the nutrient concentration that would be held within that water, the pH of the soil, the amount of root mass that is there to intercept these nutrients and be able to take those nutrients up, the plant uptake process itself, how it's able to take those nutrients from the root systems up into the plant, the nutrient buffering capacity, which is the amount of holding capacity or how large a bank account that soil has, and the temperature of the soil. Good example of temperature relations is phosphorus. There's plenty of research that shows that the cooler the soil is, the less able a plant is to take up phosphorus. So if we're planting a crop in a cooler part of the year, we want to add more phosphorus so that that nutrient concentration is high enough that the plants are going to be able to pull up an adequate amount for what I would call an acceptable plant growth early in the season. When we look at that nutrient availability, that nutrient content is critical around the immediate area of those roots. So when we apply any type of nutrition, we want to make sure that it stays within the area where those roots are present. We also look at that nutrient buffering or the holding capacity, referred to in some of the soil recommendations as the CEC or the cation exchange capacity, and that's the ability of a soil to hold and maintain adequate nutrient concentrations around that area that the root is going to be present in. And then we also have to know which nutrients are accessed to that plant by different uptake methods, such as mass flow, diffusion, or interception. Those are just different ways that the nutrient gets to the plant for the plant to be able to take it up and to use it. The nutrient requirements depend quite a bit on what type of crop species and yield we're looking for. The higher the yield, the higher the nutrient requirements of those plants. I would even submit to you the lower the nutrient reserve, the higher the nutrient requirement, because we're trying to build that soil as we grow a crop. And it's interesting though, when we look at even different cultivars or different varieties within the same type of species, that can influence the amount of nutritional requirement that is needed. In particular, if we look at Irish potatoes, Fabula is one of them that we have found does not require as much nutrients as other varieties such as Kennebec. So when we look at this soil's nutrient availability, what is it we're actually saying? And basically all that I've talked about is a complicated way of saying we have to know what plants we're growing. We have to know the inherent ability of our soil to be able to grow the plants we want. And then we have to manage it accordingly. So each farm, based on the crops that they're growing, the types of soil that they have, and the management levels of the farmer that's there, they should be looking at their own unique nutrient management plan that's going to satisfy the needs for their location. And I cannot overemphasize that these cookie cutter plans that we find are not always the solution to the nutrient problems that we may have on our farm. For example, we're going to look at some of the different nutrient requirements for plants. And again, this is a more generic type of look, but if we look at cole crops, cucumbers, peppers, and these are bell peppers, winter squash and summer squash, and a plastic mulch grown tomatoes, we can look at some trends as far as the amount of phosphorus and potassium that is needed, and also the amount of nitrogen that's needed based on the amount of yield that we expect from some of these crops. Higher yielding crops, such as the cole crops, bell peppers, and tomatoes, are going to require more nitrogen input for them to produce an acceptable amount of product. So how do we supply that? How do we get that nutrient back to that plant? Well, this is where we look at the types of fertilizers that we have available to us and how we can utilize them in the best methods. If we look at the products that are listed, the first products there, except for the very last one, are dry products, worm castings, the biofish. There's a product called Pre-Plant Plus, seabird guano, blood meal, green sand, bone meal, sulfate of potash, rock phosphate, and then the last one is our all-purpose liquid. Each one of these, as we look at the numbers that are listed, represent the percentage of either nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium that those products are going to have. Dry products are based on a 100-pound weight. If I look at the worm castings, that means there would be 1.5 pounds of actual nitrogen for every 100 pounds of fertilizer that I would use. Phosphorus, there would be 3.5 pounds for every 100 pounds of fertilizer. And potassium, 1.3 pounds for every 100 pounds of fertilizer. That's important for us to be able to calculate the amount of nutrients necessary to grow these crops. When we look at these fertilizer rates, again, the soil test is going to give us the pounds of actual nutrient per acre that is required. And again, it's a simple percentage calculation. The number on the bag is how many pounds of nutrient for every 100 pounds of fertilizer. So we use that seabird guano as an example. It's a 12-12 2.5. So for every 12 pounds of nitrogen, 12 pounds of phosphorus, and 2.5 pounds of potash, we're going to supply that with 100 pounds of fertilizer. Fertigation gives us a little bit of a different aspect also, and fertigation is where we would add nutrients through a drip irrigation system. One of the things that I will highly recommend is make sure that you use a filter because the drip tape emitters that we're using will plug with even the smallest of particles. So as we are mixing up a nutrient base, adding water to a dry fertilizer or using a liquid fertilizer, make sure that there is a filter on that injector end before it goes into the system to fertilize your plants. We can use either a water-soluble dry fertilizer or a liquid source for these calculations or for the fertigation. And when we look at the dry fertilizer, it's calculated as a percentage on the dry weight. But liquid fertilizer is a percentage based on the weight per gallon. If we look at something like an all-purpose liquid fertilizer, each gallon weighs 10 pounds. So instead of 100 pounds to figure out what our nutrient reserve is, we would look at 3.7 divided by 100, which gives us our percent down into a decimal, multiplied by the 10 pounds. So in each gallon, we would have 0.37 pounds of nitrogen, 0.27 pounds of phosphorus, and 0.37 pounds of potassium. This gives us a way to be able to at least know how much product we're putting out and be able to use that into our nutrient plan that we're trying to put together. When we're trying to determine how much fertilizer we're going to apply, we're going to use tomatoes as an example. Plastic culture grown tomatoes require 150 pounds of nitrogen, 150 pounds of phosphorus, and 200 pounds of potassium per acre. So if we're growing, let's say 3 acres, the total amount that we require would be 450 pounds of nitrogen, 450 pounds of phosphorus, 600 pounds of potassium. So what would be our best nutrient source and what amount? If we look at an acre basis, 150, 150, and 200, the seabird guano is a 12, 12, 2.5, which means there's 12% nitrogen, 12% phosphorus, 2.5% potassium. Convert that over into a decimal point by dividing by 100. And we look for the largest number to start off our calculations. If we know we need 150 pounds, we divide that by the largest percentage, and that would give us 1,250 pounds per acre of seabird guano that we would use. We know that that supplies 150 pounds of nitrogen, 150 pounds of phosphorus. If we take the 1,250 pounds, multiply that by the 0.025, it shows us that we get 31.25 pounds of potassium in that seabird guano. If we need 200, we subtract the 31.25, which means we still have 268 pounds of potassium that is required per acre. If we use products such as sulfate of potash, that is 22% potassium, we would take the 168.75 divided by 0.22, which tells us that there's 767 pounds of sulfate of potash that would be needed per acre to fulfill the requirements that we found. So we're looking at somewhere around 3,750 pounds of seabird guano that would be needed, and roughly 2,300 pounds of sulfate of potash for that 3-acre field that we would be growing. So what happens when we've put all of that nutrient down? The plants are growing. We get weather conditions that are not conducive. Maybe we don't have enough rainfall. Maybe we have too much. What are some of the nutrient deficiencies that we might find in the fields and in some of these plants? So when we look at nutrient deficiencies, what we're talking about is the visual signs that we see. And these visual signs are the consequences of some type of disturbance within the plant where it is not receiving adequate nutrition. The major nutrients within the plant, such as the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, the calcium, it affects so many different things going on within the plant, such as the hormone development, chlorophyll production, amino acid formation, ATP, which is the energy house for that plant to grow, DNA and RNA. All of these things are impacted by the amount of fertility that's available in that plant. So if we look at a plant that may have a poor growth rate, it may be spindly in appearance. We have smaller leaves in the top, and the older ones may fall off prematurely. We see a yellow color or a yellow cast, what we call chlorotic look to it. We may have less root growth. Plants that are maturing earlier, the vegetative growth is shortened. The quality of that plant may decrease. All of these are signs that we may see from a nitrogen deficiency. Here's an example of an area that is waterlogged, where the nitrogen was leached out of the root zone where the plant could not take it up. And we can see the yellow or the chlorotic look and the stunted appearance of that corn crop where it's already starting to put out a tassel where the other corn is still actively growing. Basically what this plant is saying is, I do not have enough nutrient reserves for me to complete the life cycle in a manner which is appropriate. Therefore, I'm going to shorten the lifespan, try to produce seed so I can survive. Phosphorus Normally what we see with it is a stunted appearance. We may see the older leaves starting to fall off. We're going to see a different color to them. We might find a dark green leaf. We may find some distortion with that leaf. But one of the indicators of phosphorus deficiency is either a red or a purplish tint on the leaves or the stems. So when we look at a plant that's severely phosphorus limited, we start to find this reddish purple discoloration. Potassium, we find the older leaves that will start to yellow or show chlorosis, and that's because potassium is a mobile nutrient. So the plant is removing it from the older leaves and is locating it to the newer leaves so they can adequately grow. The leaves may have what we call a hawkbill appearance, where the tips of the leaves will start to curl downward. And we can also have marginal scorch, which is a burning or a browning, the death of the edges of the leaf that's going to dry up and crumble away. This is a good example of potassium deficiency in tomato, where we see both that hawkbilling or that curling appearance and also the marginal burn that's indicative of potassium. Other things that we can find may be a calcium deficiency. We can find those same curled or distorted type of leaves, the hook appearance at the tip of the leaf, but we're also going to find a stunted growth, and we're also going to see shortened, stubby, or thickened brown roots. And sometimes this can be the result of the competition for other nutrients similar in size, such as potassium and magnesium. The biggest thing that we normally find in calcium deficiency is when we have blossom end rot in tomatoes. And this is where we find an upset of the balance of either moisture, temperature, combinations of those things during the growing season, where that plant may not be able to physically take up enough calcium to meet the growing needs of that fruit. And therefore we find those darkened spots that are starting to decay in the bottom of our tomatoes. That's indicative of blossom end rot. Maybe plenty of calcium present, but the weather conditions or other factors may be prohibiting that plant from being able to take it up and to use it effectively. So when we look at the overall agenda with what we're talking about as far as fertilizing goes, one of the things that we really have to look at is how much fertilizer do I actually have to efficiently and effectively grow a crop. We don't want to put too much fertilizer on and waste our money. We don't want to put too little on and risk our yields. I recommend everybody start off the year with a soil sample. In Virginia, those are free for all of our commercial producers. So there is no cost for you to analyze what your plants need for that growing season. To me, this is one of the most basic diagnostic tools we have where we can determine whether you may have a nutritional problem that you will need to address. And then once you receive those results back, follow them. It doesn't do any good to know what you need to do and then fail to do it. The other thing when we look at taking those soil samples is how we should do that. In crop areas, we need to take at least a 6 to 8 inch core. We need to take as many of them as practical throughout the field. We'll mix those up and we'll use a subsample of that to fill that box to send off. We're going to adjust our pH as needs be, and we're going to adjust our phosphorus and potassium into that medium or high level so we maintain that inherent nutrient level that we have in that soil. And again, why is soil fertility so important? The big issue is it helps us to increase production, which is going to also make for a healthier plant. It's going to help increase a tolerance to stresses, and it's going to make a healthier plant overall, which is going to withstand temperature, insects, diseases, and other issues that we're faced with during the growing season. One of the things that I have not spoken much about is the pH and how that soil acidity affects the amount of nutrients that are available to the plant. And this is a good chart that sort of shows when we look at that 6.0 to upwards of 6.5 and 7 range, this is where the majority of your essential plant nutrients are going to be available for that plant. If we get higher than that, if we get lower than that, the essential plant nutrients become less available. They're held tighter or concreted into the soil. But if you notice, you start to see an increase in toxic nutrients, your aluminum, your manganese, zinc, other things that can harm the plants start to become more available as the acidity goes lower, and then molybdenum and others become more available as it goes higher. So to maintain the balance that we need for those plants to be able to grow efficiently and effectively, we need to maintain the proper pH of that soil for those plants. In Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, I commonly see pH as being one of the major limiting factors for our plant growth and development. The soil pH, as I said, it has a significant effect on the amount of nutrients that are available for that plant to grow, and it also ties into the amount of nitrogen that is held within the soil and made unavailable to that plant. When we lime, we neutralize that acidity so it maintains that proper level for the essential plant nutrients, but then we can also supply calcium and magnesium for those plants to be able to produce properly also. The one thing that I wanted to close on is speaking of Liebig's law of minimums. And Liebig's law basically says that the level of plant production can be no greater than what is allowed by the most limiting of the essential plant growth factors. So we can do everything right. We can take care of the acidity. We can make sure our nitrogen, our phosphorus, and our potassium levels are correct. But if we have temperatures that are too hot or too cold, if we have moisture levels that are excessive or deficient, whatever the most limiting factor is going to determine that plant production for that year.